Adrian's first steps onto Elysra felt like stepping into a dream someone had left on pause. One of those dreams where the air smells faintly of ozone and sugar, and gravity refuses to behave quite normally. The ground beneath him was smooth, almost glassy, reflecting the sky's shifting colors like liquid paint, and as he walked, tiny motes of bioluminescence clung to his boots, winking as though curious about this clumsy human intruder. Floating above the ground were market stalls, glimmering in every shade of teal and violet, suspended by thin threads of anti-gravity cables that hummed softly like a chorus of contented bees. Adrian had been trained for diplomatic encounters, but nothing in any briefing or simulation had prepared him for the alien woman who appeared at the central plaza, long ears curling gracefully behind her head, eyes reflecting the colors of the crystalline trees surrounding them, and a smile that hinted at mischief rather than welcome. He tried to bow, which is what humans did in formal introductions, but the ground beneath him shifted unexpectedly, and he landed in an awkward squat, arms flailing. The little floating drone carrying a pitcher of sparkling violet liquid nearly collided with his forehead before he snagged it midair and almost resealed it. Except now the top sprayed across his shoulder, and the plaza like a miniature fireworks display. Liara's laughter rang out, musical and teasing, echoing slightly as if the plaza itself wanted to join in. "You humans are clumsy," she said, her voice smooth, like honey mixed with the crisp sound of bells. "Do you practice this awkwardness, or does it come naturally?" Adrian's tongue tied itself in knots as he straightened, dripping with purple liquid, and he replied, I always aim to impress." She raised an eyebrow, well, the human equivalent of it, her long ears twitching in amusement. "And yet you're impressing nothing but gravity itself," she said, smirking. He couldn't help but laugh, partly out of embarrassment, partly because her voice had a lilt that made even humiliation feel strangely charming. "If I had a beautiful wife like you," he said impulsively, waving a hand vaguely to indicate her, "I'd make her very happy." Liara tilted her head, her ears curving forward in the faintest gesture of curiosity. "Then make me happy," she said. There was no malice in it, no testing or mockery, just a clear, unflinching challenge. Adrian blinked. He had expected flirtation, coy laughter, perhaps a dismissive remark about human arrogance, but not this. Not this invitation wrapped in a statement that could have been a game or a threat, or both. The plaza itself seemed to sense the tension, or maybe it was just Adrian's imagination, as floating lights above them flickered and pulsed, projecting tiny holographic animals that danced around his head before vanishing into the air. He ducked, swatted, and stumbled, and Liara's laugh rang out again, echoing through the crystal trees. "You'll need more than charm if you want to survive Elysra," she said, her tone teasing but not unkind. "And trust me, human, charm won't save you from the floating fruit vendors." Adrian straightened once more, brushing imaginary dust from his tunic, and he found himself following her as she glided, more floated, through the plaza. Her movements were effortless, each step a subtle defiance of gravity that humans could only dream of achieving. She pointed out the market stalls, some selling fruits that pulsed with light, some displaying small animals that shifted colors according to the owner's mood. "They taste different depending on your emotional state," she explained, flicking her long fingers over a fruit that shimmered green and orange. "Try not to eat anything that looks like it's angry, or you'll regret it." Adrian picked up a small sphere that glimmered blue. He hesitated, trying to recall what blue meant in human terms. Sadness, calm, hunger. "Is it safe?" he asked, unsure whether she was teasing him. "It's only deadly if you panic," she said, smirking. "But I think you're already halfway there." Adrian bit into it anyway. The taste hit like fireworks in his mouth, tangy and sweet and vaguely metallic, and he coughed as purple sparks shot out from the corners of his mouth. Liara laughed, and this time he couldn't help but join her. The laughter was infectious, making the plaza feel less like an alien world and more like a bizarre playground. As the day stretched on, She guided him past floating fountains that defied the laws of physics, their water arcing upward only to split into droplets that danced in midair, refracting the sky's colors. She demonstrated a local sport, tossing small orbs that hovered mid-flight before responding to thought commands. Adrian attempted to catch one, only for it to stick to his hand, hover there mocking him, and emit a faint buzzing noise. "Humans," Liara said, shaking her head, "you think you're clever, but you've never negotiated with a floating ball." Adrian flailed, finally flicking it into the air where it hovered just out of reach, and she laughed again, the sound echoing against crystalline trees. By the time the sun, or the Elysian equivalent, a luminescent sphere of shifting hues, began to dip behind the floating towers, Adrian realized two things. First, surviving Elysia required more than physical dexterity. It demanded attention, intuition, and a willingness to be utterly ridiculous without shame. Second, he couldn't stop thinking about Liara, her long ears twitching in amusement, her eyes reflecting a depth of curiosity and intelligence that was simultaneously intimidating and irresistible. Every joke, every stumble, every minor embarrassment had brought them closer, in a way he didn't expect but somehow felt like it belonged to him already. They paused near a crystalline lake, its surface floating above the ground in waves of light, reflecting their shadows in fractured patterns. Adrian swallowed, unsure how to speak, feeling the absurdity of his own words weighing against the gravity of the moment. "If I had a beautiful wife like you," he started, and she raised an eyebrow. "Yes." Her ears flicked lightly, an invitation to continue. I'd make her very happy," he finished, the words heavier with sincerity now than the careless joke that had begun the day. Liara studied him, the corners of her mouth tugging into a faint smile, and whispered almost teasingly, "Then make me happy." Adrian realized in that moment that Elysia wasn't just a planet of strange laws and floating fruit. It was a place where the rules of connection, laughter, and courage were completely rewritten. And he had just volunteered to play by them, fully and without hesitation, all while hoping he wouldn't trip over the next floating drone or, worse, fall hopelessly in love. Adrian woke to the subtle hum of Elysia's morning, the air alive with shifting colors, and the faint scent of ozone mixed with sweet, tangy pollen that floated from the crystal groves. He had spent the night in a guest chamber that hovered slightly above the ground, supported by thin anti-gravity columns that gave the room a gentle sway, like sleeping on a boat in zero gravity. He sat up, still a little stiff from his awkward tumble into the floating lake the previous evening, and noticed Liara standing by the window, or rather, floating slightly above the floor, her long ears twitching as she surveyed the morning's light. She looked human enough that he could have mistaken her for one of Earth's more ethereal models, if not for those ears, their elegant curvature marking her as Elysia's lineage of thinkers and diplomats. Her eyes caught his, and for a moment she didn't speak, letting the silence stretch like a taut string. Then she grinned, a glimmer of mischief dancing across her features. "You slept well for someone who flailed into a lake yesterday," she said. "I half expected you to wake up transformed into one of the local fish." Adrian groaned, swinging his legs over the edge of the floating bed, only to find that gravity wasn't as cooperative as he hoped. His boots hovered an inch above the floor. "I can assure you I'm still entirely human," he said, trying not to wobble as he stood. "Though, admittedly, wet and humiliated counts as a kind of metamorphosis, I suppose." Liara laughed, the sound like musical chimes filtering through the crystal trees outside. "You humans and your dramatic flair," she said, drifting closer, her long ears flicking in amusement. "I suppose that's part of what makes you endearing." Their morning began with a stroll through the floating markets, which had awoken in a riot of color and movement. Adrian tried to keep up with Liara's graceful glide as she navigated the suspended pathways, stepping between vendors whose wares seemed to defy gravity itself. Fruits hovered in midair, pulsing with faint internal light, and mechanical pets floated alongside their owners, responding to subtle thought commands. These are mood fruits, Liara explained, plucking a sphere that glimmered green. Eat one and it will change flavor depending on your emotional state. Adrian hesitated. So, if I'm nervous, it'll taste like panic. Liara tilted her head, ears twitching. Exactly, but don't worry, you'll survive. She handed him a glowing orange sphere and he bit cautiously. The flavor exploded in his mouth, a dizzying mix of sweetness, tang, and something vaguely metallic. His eyes watered and he sputtered, knocking over a hovering tray of tiny, levitating pastries. Liara caught one midair with a flick of her hand and placed it delicately back on the tray. You'll get the hang of it eventually, though your coordination is uniquely human. Adrian grinned sheepishly. I prefer charmingly awkward, thank you very much. As they continued, she taught him the basics of Elisra's physical quirks. Gravity shifted subtly depending on mood and proximity to certain crystalline structures, meaning a misstep could send a human tumbling into midair or skimming along the top of a floating lake. Adrian stumbled more than once, and each time Liara laughed, not mockingly, but as though she genuinely found joy in his efforts. You might actually survive here, she said once, eyes sparkling, provided you don't try to run from a fruit vendor again. Their path led them to a demonstration of local sport, a game involving levitating orbs that responded to thought commands. Liara placed an orb in Adrian's hand. It hovered obediently, then darted away in a playful zigzag. Adrian chased it, arms flailing, only to collide with a vendor's display of mood fruits. The orb shot upward and bounced harmlessly off a hovering chandelier, leaving Adrian crouched on the floor, panting. Liara's laughter rang out again, echoing among the crystalline towers. You humans are spectacularly entertaining, she said, and you think your athletic prowess is impressive. By midday, they arrived at a floating garden where plants hummed softly and leaves shimmered in hues Adrian had no names for. Liara demonstrated the proper way to communicate with the flora, using subtle gestures and thought pulses. Adrian tried, of course, with predictably clumsy results. A plant tilted toward him only to shoot a spray of luminescent pollen across his face. Ah, pollen, Liara said, stifling a laugh. It reacts to surprise. I think it likes you already. Adrian wiped his eyes and grinned. I'm becoming quite popular with Elisra's flora, apparently. After several hours of exploration, they paused at the edge of a lake that floated in midair, its surface glittering with suspended droplets that reflected the shifting sky. Adrian attempted to impress her by skipping across the lake's surface, forgetting the delicate balance of gravity. He plunged halfway in, legs flailing, creating a small wave of suspended water that hovered midair before settling. Liara simply shook her head, ears flicking, and said, You never fail to amuse me, Adrian. Perhaps that's part of making me happy, constant entertainment. He laughed, coughing up a mouthful of lake water, and she reached out, floating closer, brushing a hand over his dripping hair. And yet, she said softly, voice low now, there's more to Elisra than amusement. Adrian looked at her, puzzled. She gestured toward the horizon where massive crystalline towers rose, pulsating faintly with energy. Understanding our world requires more than humor. It requires patience, empathy, and connection. Are you willing to learn? Adrian swallowed, feeling the weight of her gaze, and for the first time, he realized that surviving Elisra wasn't just about avoiding floating hazards or mastering alien fruits. It was about understanding Liara, her world, and the delicate emotional currents that governed it. I'm willing, he said, voice firm despite the lingering laughter at his earlier antics. Liara's long ears twitched approvingly. Good, she said. Then perhaps you might one day make me happy. But first we have lessons to learn, and I expect you to fail gloriously. Adrian grinned, dripping water and pollen, still slightly dazed, and replied, Failure has always been my specialty. Consider this an exhibition. Liara laughed again, and together they ventured deeper into the floating city, a human and an alien, stumbling, laughing, and learning the strange rhythms of a world that refused to be ordinary. The sun shifted, bathing Elysra in prismatic light, and Adrian realized with a mixture of awe and trepidation that every step in this world, and every step toward Liara, was a challenge, a joke, and a promise all at once. Adrian woke to the hum of Elysra's dawn, the floating city bathed in soft, prismatic light. He stretched carefully, aware that gravity here shifted subtly with mood and temperature, a minor misstep enough to send a human tumbling into midair. He glanced at Liara, who hovered gracefully beside a crystalline window, her long ears catching the glint of morning like delicate antennae, her eyes tracing the arcs of sunlight reflecting off the floating towers. She was calm, serene, yet there was an unmistakable spark in her gaze, a signal that the day ahead was anything but ordinary. Adrian rubbed his jaw, still sore from yesterday's unexpected tumble into a hovering fountain. "I feel like Elysra is conspiring against me," he muttered, and Liara laughed, the sound warm and musical, bouncing across the crystal halls. "Or perhaps," she said, "it simply enjoys watching humans struggle with elegance it has long perfected." Their morning began with light training, navigating floating platforms, practicing the thought-linked control necessary to interact with Elysra's levitating objects, and avoiding the mischievous fruit spheres that hovered midair, sensitive to sudden emotional surges. Adrian stumbled more than once, colliding with a floating display of glowing plants that responded to surprise by emitting tiny shock pulses. "I swear these plants have a vendetta," he said, eyes watering from the minor shocks. Liara twitched her long ears and floated closer, brushing a hand against his shoulder. "Consider it their way of welcoming you," she said, her voice teasing but gentle. "Or perhaps testing if you're patient enough to survive here." But the calm didn't last. Alarms rippled through the floating towers, subtle vibrations in the crystalline structure that carried farther than sound. Adrian's stomach sank. "What now?" he asked. Liara's expression hardened, though her ears twitched in controlled alert. "A rogue faction from the outer colonies has found a way to manipulate Elysra's energy crystals. They intend to weaponize them, risking the floating city and its inhabitants." Adrian blinked. "Weaponize floating fruit." She smirked despite the urgency. "No, the crystals, not the fruit. Though I admit combining the two would be spectacularly catastrophic." Adrian couldn't help but laugh, though tension gripped him. "So, save the city, save the plants, and don't trip over the floating chandeliers. Got it." Liara rolled her eyes, her ears flicking, and motioned for him to follow. The city shifted as they moved, floating platforms adjusting, gravity subtly bending around them as if anticipating their path. They navigated past crystalline towers that hummed with stored energy, and through the markets where vendors had hastily suspended their goods midair. Adrian found himself dodging a levitating basket of mood fruits, only to have it drift back toward him. He caught it with a sheepish grin. "I swear, Elysra wants me humbled every step of the way." Liara laughed softly, though the tension in her eyes didn't fade. "And yet, you persist. That may be your strongest skill, human." At the rogue faction's location, a partially collapsed floating platform near a tower of energy crystals, Adrian and Liara assessed the situation. The faction had activated a crude siphoning device, pulling energy from the tower and sending it into unstable conduits. Sparks of raw energy shot into the air, creating dangerous arcs that warped gravity around them. Adrian's heart raced, yet he found himself calming, using the lessons Liara had taught him. Patience, observation, and careful adjustment of thought-linked controls. He floated closer to the device, tentatively aligning a levitating sphere he had been practicing with earlier to disrupt the siphoning conduit. "So it's like throwing a ball into a really angry storm," he muttered. Liara rolled her eyes but smiled. "Something like that, but do try not to die in the process." Adrian's first attempt was chaotic. The sphere shot sideways, ricocheting off the energy arcs and nearly knocking him into a floating wall of crystals. Liara's ears twitched, and she reached out with precise control, steadying both him and the sphere with her thought pulses. "Focus," she said, her voice calm yet commanding. "You've learned more than I thought, but now apply it." Taking a deep breath, Adrian adjusted his mind, centering on the sphere and on the fluctuating gravity. The next attempt was precise. The sphere struck the siphoning device, redirecting energy back to the tower. Sparks fizzled, the floating platform stabilized, and the rogue faction's devices powered down. Adrian floated back, a mix of triumph and disbelief plastered across his wet, pollen-specked face. "I did it, I think." Liara approached, ears twitching with amusement. "You did," she said, brushing a hand across his shoulder. "And without flailing into the crystals." Adrian grinned, though he knew flailing had been half the process. "Victory through spectacular incompetence," he said. She laughed, her musical voice echoing in the air, and for a moment all the danger and chaos seemed distant. The aftermath involved calming the city, restoring balance to the energy crystals, and returning the floating platforms and gardens to their original alignment. Adrian helped where he could, his confidence growing with each minor success. He realized he no longer stumbled as much, that he could anticipate the floating objects, that he could think in subtle pulses rather than brute force. The lessons of patience, humility, and observation had begun to root themselves, not only in his actions but in his mind. By evening, they returned to the crystalline lake that had first challenged him. The surface shimmered, reflecting both their forms and the sky's swirling prismatic colors. Adrian looked at Liara, still elegant, her long ears framing her face as she floated beside him. He felt a weight in his chest, a mix of gratitude, exhilaration, and something heavier, something more intimate. "Liara," he said quietly, "if I had a beautiful wife like you." She raised an eyebrow, ears flicking slightly. "Yes." I'd make her very happy," he finished, the words no longer a joke but a truth forged in the trials of the day, in the chaos of the city, and in the subtle lessons she had taught him. Liara studied him, her expression softening. For a moment the lake seemed to hold its breath, the floating droplets pausing midair. Then she smiled, brushing a hand against his cheek, her ears twitching gently. "Then make me happy," she whispered, echoing the challenge she had issued days before. This time it was an invitation, a confirmation, and a promise. Adrian laughed, a warm, relieved sound, and reached out, taking her hand. "I think I've finally got the hang of it," he said. Liara's laugh joined his, musical and resonant, filling the air and scattering reflections across the floating lake. The world around them, chaotic earlier in the day, now felt alive but safe, as if Elisru itself approved of their triumphs and their bond. They floated together across the lake, sharing light banter and small jokes, the tension of danger replaced by playful teasing. Adrian realized he was no longer merely a visitor to Elisra. He was part of its rhythm, its oddities, and most importantly, part of Liara's world. He had grown. He had learned patience, attentiveness, courage, and how to embrace the absurdity of existence with humor. He had stumbled, splashed, and flailed, but in doing so, he had arrived at something far more significant, a connection that transcended species, a love forged in laughter, risk, and understanding. As the sun, or Elisra's radiant sphere, set, casting the floating city in warm, fractured light, Adrian and Liara rested on the shimmering edge of the lake. He squeezed her hand gently, ears brushing, and smiled. "So, how do I make you happy exactly?" Liara's grin was mischievous, but her eyes shone with trust. "Step by step, human, step by step." And as they watched the colors of the sky shift and the floating droplets glimmer around them, Adrian felt a peace he had never known, a joy tempered with understanding, and a certainty that Elisra and Liara had changed him forever. The city hummed gently around them, and for the first time he felt entirely at home in a world that had once seemed impossibly strange. They laughed again, small jokes echoing into the night, the floating lake reflecting not just their forms, but the bond they had forged, a human and an alien, navigating love, chaos, and laughter together.